Welcome to the latest edition of our series, Leadership Lessons in Troubled Times. These free online fireside chats are brought to you by the Schulich Executive Education Centre, or SEEC. My name is Robert Lynn, Associate Director at SEEC and moderator of today's session, Leadership Lessons from the Mining Industry. Our guest is David Garofalo, Chairman and CEO of the Marcius Precious Metal Funds. He's also Chairman of the Board of Great Panther Mining Limited. David will be interviewed today by SEEC's Executive Director, Dr. Alan Middleton. If you should have any questions during this session, please feel free to use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. We will try to ask as many questions as time permits. Also, we are recording this session for those who are not able to attend today's live event. Now, let's get started. Alan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Robert, and welcome, David. We're absolutely delighted that you're joining us today for a whole bunch of reasons, not least of which is mining's one of those industries that doesn't tend to have nice, predictable paths for the future. So a lot of us have been complaining about, the impact of COVID and having to pivot and change. But you've been involved in an industry that's had to do that for a while because of safety issues, political issues, up and down in pricing. So can you talk a little bit about the experience in the industry and how that set you up for what's going on now?
Well, in many of the countries that we operate, we act almost as quasi-governmental organizations. We're operating in areas that have poor infrastructure, that have poor development track records, in communities that really are getting by on subsistence standards. And as a result, we've had to develop infrastructure around the mine sites in the broader community, engage stakeholders broadly, not only at the mine site, but right through our supply chain, right to the ports, ensuring that we engage all of our stakeholders and they're all benefiting from our mining activities. But the COVID crisis has demonstrated the importance of having to do that because, for example, Great Panther, where we operate in Brazil, Brazil has a very, very poor track record right now of dealing with the COVID crisis. So we've effectively had to put in medical protocols that you would expect in a developed country you'd find in the broader community, in the healthcare setting that we enjoy here in Canada, for example. So we've had to establish protocols for employees as they come on site and ensure that they're in good health. And if they're not, proactively quarantining them, or if there's a risk or they have underlying medical conditions. So we've had to put that infrastructure in place, both human and otherwise, to ensure that our workforce is healthy. But we've been equipped to do that as mining companies because we've had to do that in the broader community on a host of social issues and health issues on an ongoing basis.
Yeah. How over time have you managed to do that? Because that's what's been impressive about the mining sector, your ability to pivot and do this stuff.
Well, it's an existential imperative for mining companies. We've had to do that in order to get the social license, if not the actual legal permitting to get these operations up and running. Mine sites, unfortunately, are not found in the middle of urban centers, often found in very, very remote areas, in sometimes politically risky areas of the world without the strong governmental infrastructure that we enjoy here in Canada. So as a result, in order to get these projects developed, it's required broad-based stakeholder engagement, local communities, the government, and for that matter, even outside the country, engaging our own Canadian government, even if we're developing something in another country, to ensure that we're living up to our Canadian standards as we operate abroad. So we've had to do that in order to develop mines in increasingly trickier jurisdictions.
Is it in your training of your management people and your people on the ground? I've heard an expression that mining management might be planned above ground, but it actually all happens in the ground. Is that a fair point? How do you go about the training and development there?
Well, it actually starts with our exploration geologists. So if we're coming into a new jurisdiction, you only have one opportunity to make a first impression.
Right.
If those exploration geologists aren't trained in community engagement tactics early on, that can really sour the relationships and sour the environment. And getting that social license, trying to recapture it later on, is very, very difficult. So it does require training from the very bottom of the organization all the way up, and from the earliest stages of engagement in these communities that have geologically prospective opportunities.
Mm. I think you should be helping non-mining industries do that, because one of the themes we've had in this series is the shortening of the hierarchies and the importance of training and development of your people on the ground. So you may have another role as a consultant at some point. Before we come back to management in general, I'd be lax if I didn't ask you how you see the mining future, and particularly something that you talked with us about earlier, the difference in the world between base and precious metals in terms of markets and development. Could you talk a little how you see the future there?
Sure. Well, on the first point, in terms of my perspective on mining generally, I'm an eternal optimist. I've been in the business for over 30 years, and I've always been proud of the fact that mining, maybe with the exception of academia, is the one industry in Canada where we actually export talent.
Yeah.
So even though we have a robust oil and gas business, a lot of that talent, quite often in capital, is imported.
Yep.
You know, for example, from Houston, Saudi Arabia, China, whatnot. But you know, the world looks to Canada for mining expertise and for mining capital. It's in our DNA. And so it's always left me with a sense of optimism. I've never been upset when foreigners come in and take over Canadian mining companies. That just speaks to the geological prospectivity in this country, and speaks to the talent that we have inherent in the country, and not just in the mining sector specifically, but also in all of the support industries around that, whether it's legal, financial, and whatnot. It's very much embedded in our DNA. So when we lose a company, it's kind of like trimming the top of a hedge off. The roots are deep, the hedge grows back, and we see a proliferation of new ventures in the mining sector pop up all over the place. And we're certainly seeing this in this robust gold price environment that we're enjoying now. And to your second question, that does speak to the dichotomy that we're seeing in base and precious. Base has shown some signs of recovery recently. Base metals tend to be tied to the prospects economically globally. And right now, there's a lot of trepidation about what's going to happen to global economic growth. And that's undermined the performance of base metals, which are really driven by consumption for industrial use. Whereas precious tends to be a barometer of uncertainty in the market, low interest rates. It's really gold as a currency. There's been undermining confidence in global paper currencies as there's been a proliferation of new money supply, quantitative easing, and gold is seen as a store of value in that environment, particularly in a low interest rate environment, which is at 0 to negative, both in nominal and real terms. That's removed the opportunity cost of owning gold. So it's driven gold prices upwards. And so I see gold having a good run here for the next little while, because I don't see the end of quantitative easing anytime soon. And I guess conversely, you know, that uncertainty in the global economy that's driving quantitative easing undermines base metal performance.
Thinking about areas where there is a lot of mining activity, which is, you know, pretty well everywhere these days, but I'm thinking particularly of Africa, where there's been a lot of activity recently. How does the change in base metal demand, because it has a direct impact on the economies there, and so the whole import, export, and supply chain system, and so how do you see that evolving as we get new trade deals or no trade deals going forward?
Well, look, I think the proliferation of trade deals is extremely important in helping to develop the infrastructure and the governance necessary to advance mineral development in the emerging economies. The difficulty that we experience in operating in developing countries is the inability to get a social license, the inability to get the infrastructure in place that we so desperately need to get these mines developed.
Like Brazil that you were talking about earlier. Yeah.
So trade deals, to the extent that we can open up those markets and open up our market to their products, will help to develop those economies and hopefully give them the tax base to require, the infrastructure they require to make development easier in those more challenging jurisdictions.
Yeah. Maybe you could comment on something that I've heard fed back, that one of the strengths of Canada in mining, back to the reasons you said earlier, is also our standards tend to be higher than many other competitors from different nations. And I'm not putting down the Australians and the Americans here, but I'm constantly told one of the strengths Canada takes out is how we apply standards in relation to community, health of workers, and that area. Is that a fair compliment?
I think it is. And again, it's because we built up such a robust industry here in Canada. And look, we made our share of mistakes over many decades and learned from those. And so as we diversify our investments outside of Canada into other jurisdictions, we're applying those same high standards, the ones that we've learned through painful lessons, through experience, into other countries. And it really behooves us to ensure that our standards are no less than they are in Canada when we start to invest in these other countries.
Mm-hmm. Coming up to the COVID question, I'm going to put you on the spot as global advisor to industry, not just mining outside. We talked a little bit earlier about the training and development and how you have to think about all those elements. Let's move. What advice would you give to leaders in other sectors, having gone through this, and as we go to recovery, what areas should they be paying attention to? And I'm thinking about planning and the ability to change and plan when things change, or the impact of social and political issues. So I think there's a lot of learning from your sector in general across our economy. What do you think?
Well, what struck me as we've gone through this crisis is changes that we're looking to make, whether it's labor force practices, whether it's also the adoption of new technologies, things that would have taken years to consider, we've had to accelerate into weeks. Again, as an existential imperative to maintain operations in many of the countries that we operate, because we can't get people in and out as readily as we could pre-COVID.
Yeah.
And so things that we've been considering that have been on the drawing table for a long time are now being rapidly adopted. So that we do have the ability. Will we make some mistakes in doing that? Of course, because generally you want to be a bit more methodical in adopting these technologies into your operations. But this has given us an opportunity to really put into practice things that we've been really theorizing about, trying to draw plans for. We've had to do in a rapid response type of way, and so that's exciting. And I'll give you an example. We've been experimenting with tele-remote mining at many of our mine sites. And when I was running Goldcorp, we were doing that at a couple of our mine sites in Canada.
Yeah.
And that means operating equipment from hundreds of kilometers away. So to the extent that you have that infrastructure, electronic infrastructure in place to do that, you're able to actually run the Internet of Things within your underground operations or open pit operations. Mining companies are doing that increasingly in order to reduce the footprint of our workforce at the mine site and reduce the necessity to bring them on and off the site, and sort of in that way maintain our social distancing at the sites. So that's been adopted much more quickly as a result of this COVID crisis. So there are things that have happened, unintended consequences of this that have actually been quite positive to our businesses as an industry.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. One of the things previous leaders have talked about going through this crisis is, and compliment for Canada on this, how different sectors, private sector, government, not-for-profit, unions, seem to have worked together better here to try to knock down some of the bureaucracy and the barriers of the future than some other markets. You're instantly a global industry, so you're having to deal with this in multiple ways. Are you seeing that as a trend that might happen with the sector and how it works?
Well, I certainly sense a lot more pragmatism across all of our stakeholders in terms of how to deal with this issue, this crisis, this pandemic. And I'll give you one very practical example. We're operating at Great Panther, a mine, Tucano in Brazil.
Right.
It's been operating with 3 8-hour shifts a day. In Canada, typically you would do 2 12-hour shifts a day.
Yeah.
But unions have been very difficult, challenging to deal with in dealing with that. And for a host of safety reasons, not just productivity reasons, safety reasons, you'd rather have 2 12-hour shifts a day and have 1 changeover instead of 2 changeovers over a 24-hour period. And the union in Brazil was entrenched on that point. But the COVID crisis actually drove the dialogue to a much more practical place. And we went to 12-hour shifts. And as a result, we've seen our safety performance improve. We've seen our productivity improve. And of course, that's helped us to more readily deal with the COVID crisis so that we have less movement of people on and off the site over the course of a 24-hour period. And so we're seeing that kind of, that's a tangible example, but we're seeing that kind of pragmatic dialogue happening across all of our stakeholders now, where in the past these were sacred cows, if you will. And there are many examples, whether it's on labor practices or industrial practices generally, where we've seen that kind of pragmatism, and it's driven enhanced productivity, enhanced safety practices as a result.
Yeah. Do you think we can sustain that momentum, that change as we hopefully come out of the peak of the COVID crisis? So, for instance, in our healthcare interviews, what's coming out clearly is the role of robotics and automation for distance diagnosis, and the healthcare industry has been quite open about that will have to step up, and they're working on that. So that will be a permanent change there. Do you see a similar kind of process happening with you?
Some of it will have to take, but human nature being what it is, when we get back to a steady state, I think a lot of us will revert to old habits. But look, some of the technologies have been adopted, whether something as practical as Zoom conversations, as opposed to hopping on a plane, the drop of a hat. I think we'll see a reduction in travel. This technology, I never used Zoom pre-COVID. I did. I used FaceTime occasionally with my kids and whatnot, but now it's become intrinsic to what we do day to day. And I don't see us going back entirely on that. There'll be a pickup in travel again. It's hard to replace face-to-face in certain contexts, but I think we'll start to question whether we really need to hop on that plane and really move people around when we have this type of technology readily available to us on our desktop.
I will point out to those who don't know, watching us, that you're actually coming in from Vancouver as well. So we're seamless right now. Just a pause. So if anybody has a question, please send it through the chat box, and we'll carry on with David. David, as you think forward in the mining sector in general, other than base versus precious and some of the other areas, what do you see as some of the good points that you could not forecast but hope for right now? And what do you think are some of the problems you may increasingly face?
Well, I'd say, again, the adoption of new technologies here, the more pragmatic nature of our relationships with all of our stakeholders, rolling up our sleeves, and things that didn't seem achievable in the past can be done in a very, very short order. I think we're learning to roll with the punches much more readily, given what we're facing with the COVID pandemic. And so I think that kind of attitude of getting things done, I think will serve the industry very well and serve our stakeholders very well. So I think coming out of that, that's exciting. What we face as an industry, though, is still an inability to replace what we're depleting out of the ground. I still think that we're underinvesting in exploration. And if anything, this COVID crisis has exacerbated that issue because of the difficulty of getting people onto sites to do the exploration and all logistical challenges that come with this COVID-19 pandemic. So if anything, the decline of reserves in the industry will only be exacerbated as a result of this crisis. So trying to get back into a rhythm on our exploration in order to replace what we're depleting is going to be extremely important for our industry and getting back on pace in that regard.
Thinking about exploration, how much can be done by technology? Because I gather Canada's been a bit of an advance in non-invasive exploration in areas. I've seen models that recreate strata in the ground, and we should look over there. So how's that working?
Well, there's no replacement for actual drilling and testing. You still need, statistically speaking, a representative sample of the area you're drilling with tight enough drill spacing in order to calculate a reserve. And that's geostatistics, that's It's mathematical statistics. That's an absolute imperative in order to calculate reserves. But what we are making advances on is generative work, reducing the lead time related to that generative work to identify targets to drill.
Okay.
And one example I can give you is when I was running Goldcorp, we had partnered with IBM at our Red Lake mine in Northern Ontario, and using the Watson supercomputer to basically digitize 100 years of exploration information and using the predictive powers of Watson in order to identify the next potential high-grade target.
Yeah.
And what we were endeavoring to do, that was the theory, was reduce the lead time on that generative work by upwards of 95%.
Wow.
Wow. And that was, it was starting to bear fruit shortly before we ended up merging with Newmont. And I believe they continued that work at Red Lake, given all the work that went into that. But IBM was trying to use Red Lake as a test case, given the long history of exploration data there that we could digitize, and then leverage that into doing that more broadly in the mining industry. That's exciting.
Yeah.
That could really be a game changer for exploration or business, because that is the highest risk component of the value creation equation in the mining business. It's also the most time intensive. It takes a long time from discovery to development as a result of the difficulty of getting that generative work done and doing the exploration. Typically, 10, 15, 20 years from that first drill hole to first production, because of the long lead time associated with the exploration and delineation of new deposits.
In fact, just information, as you probably know, you and in your old Goldcorp days, and IBM Watson won an innovation award for that work. I know because I was one of the judges, actually. It's very impressive. Can we talk about talent a little bit? Because, your industry is fascinating because there's a challenge of attracting people, but as you said, it's an exciting industry. It's got high tech. It's got sophisticated processes. But, we have people on the ground, as you say, they're not sitting in the middle of sophisticated cities. So how do you, as an industry, attract good talent to come by? Because on every other basis, it's a fascinating industry.
You're right. It's capital intensive. It's dynamic. We're always discovering, building, optimizing what we have. But it's still perceived as a dirty business.
Yeah.
Dirt on your fingernails. You're in remote areas of the world. But I think reducing our labor intensity, adopting technologies, not only technologies that are unique to the mining industry, but looking at technologies that are broadly available in society and trying to find ways to adapt it to the mining industry. And when I was running Goldcorp, we had an annual innovation event every year at the Prospector and Developers Convention in Toronto, where we invited technologies from other industries to find a way to adapt their technology to what we were doing. And in doing so, we said, if you're successful, it was kind of a Shark's Tank type of format. We had 5 finalists come in and we'd get over 200 applications a year. If we picked you out of that 5, you would get $1 million investment in your business and an opportunity to pilot your technology at one of our mine sites. And that got a lot of traction, got a lot of publicity. And so it's that type of reach out to the broader society, the broader business community, I think is what is going to engage people in the mining industry. And that's one example, obviously. But we need to do things like that, both at the academic level in universities, but in the economy generally, in order to plug ourselves in to what's happening in the rest of the economy as a mining industry.
Yeah, absolutely. As you think about that future industry, what are the key skill needs that you see? It sounds like analytics and some of those areas in technology will be high demand. Financial capability, which is, I guess, how you came into the industry. But what are some of the key skills you're looking for the future?
Well, Alan, all of the above, and the other thing that might surprise you is we need trades.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We need the basics. We need the heavy duty mechanics. We need the electricians. We need the carpenters. And I have to tell you, those are sometimes the most challenging positions to fill. And I've encouraged the government at various levels in all of my previous employees, whether it was at Agnico as CFO, Hudbay as CEO, and Goldcorp as CEO, is to have a robust immigration program targeting those types of skill sets where we clearly have a deficit in this country. And
Yeah,
it's not just in the mining industry. I'd say broadly speaking, we're challenged to find those tradespeople. So that yes, attracting technically oriented and technologically oriented people into the industry is very, very important given the rapid adoption of technology that we're starting to see in the mining industry. But we need to do the basics very well.
absolutely. One of the impressive things about Germany is their apprenticeship system over there, where they regard people in the trades not just, but here's how you run a business in the trade. Here's all the rest of the stuff, and I think it's something like 40% of the education dollars going to build that, and we need something like that here in general. I think, yeah. So
Yes.
yeah, totally agree. We're coming to the end of our time, so I'm gonna put you on the summary spot. That we have a question first. This is from Sonam Donkar. Commodity industry and volatility is drying up for most of the mining producers, including traders of the like, Glencore. How do you think the government, especially as money's running out because of COVID, is going to support and extend support to an industry that are key drivers for infrastructural development and building sustaining margins for time to come? Boy, if you answer that one, somebody should be paying you several $1 million. Take a run at it.
Yeah, look, I'm one that is not looking to the government to provide us solutions. I'm looking to the government in many respects to kind of stand out of the way and give us an opportunity to provide the solution ourselves and be accountable for that. So in terms of providing liquidity for our commodities, there are technologies, whether it's blockchain and the like, that will provide enhanced liquidity and enhanced access to our commodities across a broad spectrum of investors. So I think it's really in our hands to do that. I think the technology is out there, but I've seen a slow adoption in that regard in the industry. And I really put that on the industry more than on government.
Yeah. Is industry and the educational institutions and government coming together on something like the training that we just talked about important, that encouragement to do that?
You know what? I think the government has certainly made an attempt in that regard. I mean, there was the supercluster initiative, now I guess
Right.
a couple of years ago, and we competed as an industry for a portion of that funding. We fell short. And again, I put that back on the mining industry. I look at in Australia where they do a much more effective job of R&D in the mining industry because they actually coordinate their efforts as an industry, and they're able to tap into established pools of capital from the Australian government as a result of that. They've got their act together. I'd say the mining industry in Canada, we're certainly making strides in that regard, but we're not nearly at the level of sophistication of the Australian mining industry. And for that matter, the oil and gas sector here in Canada, they're much more coordinated in our activities. In Alberta, they have a cooperative in terms of sharing patents and pooling their R&D dollars together and showing that level of coordination to the government, and the government wants to throw money at them as a result. We've been operating separate from each other in the mine industry, particularly in Canada, in regards to R&D, and I think we do a much more effective job of having kind of that open code type of mentality and sharing our innovations with each other, because that'll only enhance the rapid adoption of that technology and piloting it among various mine sites.
Absolutely. Interesting. That goes back to the earlier comments that you made about, breaking down the silos, finding areas where there's win-wins. Obviously, because of competitive intelligence issues, you need to be careful of that. But for instance, the financial institutions cooperated on the back end sorting of their financial system. So it's very doable. So my last question is going to be to you. How would you sum up how you see us coming out of COVID, leadership lessons, and Bung in any last thoughts on you and the mining industry going ahead? So what should we be looking for?
Well, on the positive side, I would say that we're going to come out of this stronger from an operating perspective. I think we'll have adopted a lot of new technology, broken down silos on the operating side, been much more pragmatic. with our various stakeholders. So I think we'll be better from an operations standpoint. I'd say where I have the most concern is, again, replacing our depleting resources. If anything, this has impeded our ability to do exploration, as I said earlier on. And, given the long lead times on exploration, restarting that is going to have to be a priority for the industry, and restarting on a rapid basis and getting the capital to do that. And in the gold industry, that's much more easy than it has been in the past. Gold juniors are starting to be able to tap into traditional capital markets where they weren't even 6 months ago. That's not the case in the base metal space. I don't think it's nearly as robust there for exploration. So that's definitely a concern that's going to be looming over.
Do you see more M&A because of that need?
Yeah, if you're not finding it, you have to buy it.
Yeah.
So absolutely. And we've seen some mega mergers on the gold side because the downward trajectory in reserves was dramatic in the gold industry. It was 50% decline over 6 or 7 years, but the lack of reinvestment and exploration. So, Newmont bought Goldcorp and Barrick bought Randgold, and we've seen a bunch of other mid-tier mergers happening. There's going to be more of that for sure. And if the juniors are successful in deploying the recent capital they've raised on the exploration side, they're going to get snapped up as soon as they've delineated something of economic interest to the established producers.
Great. David, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand back to Robert to do the formal close and thank you. But it's been a delight. Robert, back to you.
Thank you to everyone for attending today's session. Please feel free to join us at our next Fireside Chat. That takes place on September 16th at 11:30 a.m. Our speaker is Dr. Michael Garden. He is Chief of Staff at Humber River Hospital. Dr. Garden will talk about leadership lessons from COVID-19, the long road to recovery. Special thanks to David Garofalo today for a great session. Thank you everyone for attending. Have a great day. Have a great summer.
Thank you, David, and good luck.
Thank you.